Hi, everyone. It's Kelly from MJ Biz. Super stoked to be here. And thank you all for tuning in with us today on LinkedIn Live. As you know, we're gearing up for our 2023 MJ BizCon conference in Vegas this November. And we look forward to catching up with you all there. But in the meantime, one of the hot topics our editorial team has been following is psychedelics, particularly new research exploring how psilocybin and other functional mushrooms can be combined with cannabis to provide medical benefits to patients. We also had a ton of questions. What's really going on with psychedelics? What's legal and what's totally not? And how will it impact the cannabis industry? So we asked Brad Dunn, editor of Remind, to put together today's expert panel to zero in on the top 5 things those of us in cannabis must know about psychedelics. Remind is all about advancing innovation, research, legislation, and commerce of psychedelics, so there's no better group to answer our questions. Make sure you drop yours in the chat throughout the presentation today, so our panel has the chance to answer before we sign off. Now, without further delay, I'll pass you over to Brad.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Brad Dunn. I'm the editor of Remind, and we are a new media and events platform that's dedicated to advancing the business of psychedelics. We launched our first Remind Psychedelics Business Forum last year in Las Vegas as part of MJ BizCon, and this year we're going to be back with a 2-day conference on November 28th and 29th. So if you want to learn more about business opportunities in psychedelics, or if you want to meet and network some of the industry's leaders and insiders, tickets are on sale now as an add-on to MJ BizCon. And if you opted in when you registered for this event, we'll be sending you a discount code after this event so that you'll save a little bit of money when you register. Great. So today we're going to be talking about the 5 things that we thought the cannabis industry should know about psychedelics. We're going to be covering the policy landscape, consumer insights, clinics and retreats, the gray market, and also functional mushrooms and other legal products that can be integrated right now in the cannabis industry. So we have 3 great expert panelists with us today who I'm going to introduce now. First, we have Courtney Barnes, who is counsel at Feldman Legal Advisors and a trailblazer in drug policy reform. She provides advisory services to the psychedelics ecosystem and was a lead drafter of Denver's psilocybin decriminalization initiative. She also has extensive experience drafting state and local policy related to cannabis and psychedelics. Courtney, welcome.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, great. And we also have Bethany Gomez. Bethany is the managing director of Brightfield Group and an expert data analyst of emerging markets with a focus on wellness, cannabis, and psychedelics. As co-founder of Brightfield Group, she has cemented the firm's position as an industry leader by emphasizing data-driven insights and compelling narratives. Bethany, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And finally, we have Chris Clausen, who is co-founder of First Person, a science-driven cognitive performance company. With over 20 years of experience in product and business development, he now focuses on conducting extensive research on the relationship between medicinal mushrooms and metabolic brain and mental health. Chris, welcome to the program.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Okay, great. Those are our panelists, and so let's just dive right in. Again, as Kelly mentioned, as we go through this, please feel free to raise any questions in the chat. We're going to answer them all at the end. We're going to have our conversation around these 5 topics first, and then we're going to build in time to answer as many of those questions as we can. So let's start with number 1, the consumer. Who is the modern psychedelics consumer? How are they using psychedelics? How have attitudes and behaviors changed between generations? And we're going to start with Bethany for this. Bethany, your firm does a ton of research. Can you just field that question? Who is today's psychedelic consumer?
Absolutely. It's really fascinating to dig into some of these generational shifts and kind of the adoption rates, especially as those have been increasing over time. So just to start off, when we look at the number of psychedelics users, 7.5% of all American adults, that's 21 plus, have used psychedelics in the last 6 months. So think about 15 million people or so nationwide using psychedelics. Now, if you compare that with cannabis, cannabis right now, we're seeing about 24% of all American adults using cannabis. So about, a little under 1/3 there. We also, when you break that down, you can look at psilocybin is the most common product. That's about 2.6% of all American adults using psilocybin, followed by MDMA or Molly, ecstasy, with 2.2, and ketamine with 1.7% of all Americans there. We also, I know we'll hit a little bit later on here in the functional mushroom space, and we get a lot of questions about that. Functional mushrooms have certainly made their way into both food and bev, as well as supplements. About 4% of all Americans are using functional mushrooms in food and bev products, and about 2% on the supplements side of the world here. So who is that psychedelics consumer? And the question we often get from cannabis companies is, how does that really compare with the cannabis consumer? So a lot of people will think about the psychedelics consumer as being kind of the party crowd, or there's a lot of kind of misconceptions and a lot of perceptions around who that psychedelics consumer is. We can tell you they are overwhelmingly skewing with younger generations, and this is really consistent across psilocybin, MDMA, and many of the other products, psychedelic products. So we can see 17% of all consumers are Gen Z, 61% millennial. This is about double the rate of the overall population. They are also skewing predominantly male. Nearly 70% of all psychedelics consumers are male, and this leans even more heavily when you look at psilocybin in particular. That also shifts pretty significantly versus the cannabis consumers. Cannabis has struck much closer to an even gender parity. It's kind of varied a little bit on one side of the pandemic versus the other, but we're now at about 45% female, consumers in cannabis, and older consumers, Gen Z, or Gen X and boomers, make up nearly half of all cannabis consumers today. So definitely some concentrations here with psychedelics consumers. They are skewing upper income. So we have, it's a very heavy skew, almost twice as likely as the general population to be high income or middle income there. Definitely not something that's appealing as much to lower income audiences, which is pretty similar, or which is very different from cannabis, which does appeal to much more of a low income crowd. The other thing I would highlight is that a lot of people think about psychedelics users as potentially, if you think about this the same way as other drugs, you may be thinking about, these consumers as not being as health forward or as health focused, which is absolutely not what we see in the data. These consumers are twice as likely to be on a plant-based diet or on a gluten-free diet than your average consumers. In many ways, they may more closely resemble plant-based cheese consumers than your average cannabis consumer. So very wellness focused, very, up on the latest health and wellness trends. And they're really kind of thinking about, psychedelics as part of their wellness journey for many of those consumers, whether they're using for specific medical conditions or, for more of kind of this wellness, side of the world.
That's great, Bethany. And I think you wanted to advance the slide for that. I think you had some data to show.
There we go.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
One more here. So how are consumers using psychedelics today? So when you look at specific conditions, first of all, you can see these numbers don't add up to 100%. So people are using for many different reasons, multiple different reasons. The number one reason is depression, 55% using for depression, nearly half, 48%, identified as using for recreational purposes. Another 38% for spiritual purposes, with PTSD coming in here as the secondary medical condition at about 36%. So these are, you can see there's a very heavy bend on medical, but also, this kind of wellness, spirituality, and, as part of kind of this overall self-care journey is really where many psychedelics consumers are really placing this. If you look at this versus cannabis, for example, cannabis users have a tendency to over-index, further on anxiety, a little bit less on depression, but you do also see a lot of these kind of wellness and recreational purposes popping up there as well. And I'll I'll send it back to you then.
Oh,
Brad.
that's fantastic, Bethany. That's great. And I just want to ask you, you've been tracking this data for a number of years on psychedelics, obviously much longer in cannabis, but what are some of the surprising shifts or trends that you've noticed recently? I mean, this movement has gained a lot of mainstream attention over the last several years. Do you feel like that mainstream is starting to change that consumer, or is this a continuation of trends that you saw before that?
Yeah, so we did see some really interesting trends, where a lot of usage spiked during and kind of immediately following the height of the pandemic and lockdown. We have seen we've seen a huge dissemination of interest in microdosing, particularly around those times. That has lost a little bit of steam amongst some older consumers, particularly in the psilocybin side of things. So we've seen some incidence rates actually go down a little bit over the last year, kind of tick down a little bit quarter over quarter. But we have seen the attitudes and kind of the perceptions around psychedelics improve, particularly amongst younger generations. And what's interesting to see as you look at kind of this generational attitudes, every year that one more year of Gen Z becomes an adult, becomes legal, we see these numbers shift again. Gen Z is overwhelmingly more likely to embrace cannabis, embrace psychedelics, to swear off alcohol or kind of reduce their alcohol consumption. They're very anti-pharma and very much pro-alternative medicine. So there's a lot of really strong underlying factors as really associated with kind of those younger generations coming of age that are showing a long-term potential for the industry here.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. And so we're going to move to our next point, but anyone in the audience who has more questions about the consumer or some of the demographics and data that Bethany just shared, please post them in the chat. So we're going to go to our number two point, which is about policy. What's legal, where, when? Courtney, who has done a ton of policy work herself to get initiatives passed, can you give us a quick overview of what's legal, where, both in terms of the FDA, federal model, and the state level policies?
Sure, of course. So when I have dialogue about psychedelics, I think it's important to start off with just sort of the definition we're using for the purposes of these conversations. We have your classical psychedelic compounds like DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, peyote, et cetera. And then we also have now MDMA and ketamine, which are really becoming an interesting point of conversation in this space. But from a technical standpoint, it is important to note that MDMA and ketamine aren't classified as hallucinogens in the federal and states Controlled Substances Act. They don't act on the brain in the same way that classical psychedelics do, but they do or can produce psychedelic experiences. So I'm going to kind of group all of those together for the purposes of having this conversation. But it is, I think, crucial to understand the distinction because there are some significant differences between MDMA and ketamine to, your naturally produced psychedelic compounds. But from a federal standpoint, cannabis and your classical psychedelics, as well as MDMA, are all still classified as Schedule I controlled substances. Even though there's a ton of research coming out, we have yet to have FDA approval of any psychedelic compound. However, MDMA is going to be the first psychedelic S compound to receive FDA approval in the next 12 to 24 months, hopefully. In addition, ketamine, just to note on that, is a Schedule III compound. So this means that it's already available for prescription. And that's why we're seeing these ketamine clinics pop up everywhere. It's not FDA approved for things like PTSD and a lot of the indications that we're seeing. There is one brand that's approved for treatment-resistant depression, but for the most part, doctors are prescribing ketamine off-label, which means they believe in their professional opinion that the benefits of using ketamine outweigh the risks. So at the federal level, all Schedule I drugs, just like cannabis, however, significant potential medicinal impact. At the state level, we have Oregon and Colorado that have passed state level access measures. And Oregon is already accepting licenses. It's a cannabis-esque program in that you will be able to go to a state licensed healing center and purchase psilocybin, so just mushrooms at this point, and use that psilocybin under the supervision of a trained facilitator, which is also licensed through the state program. You don't have to be a doctor or medical professional, but you do have to go through about 120-hour training course and pass an exam to be a facilitator in Oregon. Also different from cannabis is that you can't take the psilocybin home with you. So you can't just go to a dispensary and purchase your psilocybin product and then bring it home and use it. You do have to use it under the supervision of a facilitator at present on a licensed premises. There is some opportunity for at-home use in the future. Colorado also adopted a state level access measure in addition to a broad scope decriminalization measure. So Colorado's still about at least a year from licensing, but in, let's say, the next 2 years or so, you will also be able to go to a treatment center in Colorado and have a psilocybin experience under the supervision of a state licensed facilitator. One of the big differences between Oregon and Colorado, as I just touched on, is Colorado passed a broad scope decriminalization measure relating to not just psilocybin, but all of your, well, most of your natural psychedelic medicines. So this includes ibogaine, DMT, mescaline, not peyote, but psilocybin and psilocin as well. And now in Colorado, adults 21 years of age and older can grow their own psychedelic natural medicine, share it with others that are 21 years of age, so long as you're not getting any remuneration or you're not charging for the medicine, and use it without fear of civil or criminal prosecution, which is huge. Unlike Oregon, Oregon is just decriminalization of simple possession. So there's no at-home cultivation measure in Oregon, but we do have 2 states now that have passed access models for our first psychedelic compounds, psilocybin being the first compound that will be accessible for purchase. And then I can talk about the local level as well, or if we want to jump into the question 3 first.
No, I think that's great, Courtney. That's a great snapshot of what's legal now. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the states that are kind of moving ahead fastest, or where certain other states may be coming online with similar programs?
Sure. So we will know whether California right now has Senate Bill 58 working through the legislative process. It's in the suspense file. So it's passed the Senate in all of its assembly committees, except for the last one, which will determine whether it'll be heard on the assembly floor. We should know within the next maybe even 24 hours. So please write letters, express your support to the legislature in California, because this would be a monumental event if it were able to be passed. California also has 2 ballot measures relating to psilocybin and psychedelic research that are gathering signatures right now. So we'll see how that goes. It's very difficult to get something on the ballot in California, but not impossible. And then in addition, we've had a handful of states pass legislation to at least form working groups to study and invest money in psychedelic research. Kentucky was the last sort of big one that I think allotted millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars to researching psychedelics for addiction-related purposes with a focus on ibogaine, which is incredible. And Kentucky is not the first state you would think of to do so. Texas has passed a psychedelic research program. Maryland has allotted money to psychedelic research. So we're seeing at least a significant interest across the country in thinking more about psychedelics, even if we're not ready for an access model yet.
Great. And then, you alluded to the decriminalization and specific cities that have been kind of coming online with decrim efforts. What are they? Where are they? There's a bunch of them. What does it really mean? And what's on the horizon for that?
So similar to cannabis, we have created the psychedelics policy reform movement from the ground up, starting with local decriminalization in Denver in 2019. Since 2019, we now have at least 23 cities that have passed some sort of local, I call it deprioritization of law enforcement initiative, but commonly called decriminalization initiative. Those cities range everywhere from Washington State to Massachusetts to Michigan to most recently Minnesota, and they vary in the way that they're enacted. Most commonly, we see a resolution, which is a piece of a statement of policy passed by local city council or town council, which essentially states that we believe that law enforcement has better things to do with their money, and we don't want to use city funds engaging in the arrest and prosecution of adults who are engaging in non-commercial psychedelic activities. So grow, gather, gifting is how I like to call it. In addition, we're now seeing executive orders, which the mayor of Minneapolis just released, which is the same sort of language, but now it only took one person to make that change. In addition, there was a district attorney's office in Michigan that released an enforcement priority memorandum saying we're not going to prosecute individuals for engaging in these low-level psychedelics related offenses. So if you know someone in power in your local government, it's not that hard to get it passed. It doesn't cost a lot of money. You just need someone to make a statement. And then in addition, we have, Denver, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and those cities that passed ordinances via voter initiative. So people are getting very creative, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but just understand that a deprioritization measure is not a get out of jail free card. There is still risk associated with engaging in psychedelics activities in cities where it's deprioritized. Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for spelling that out. And that's a good segue to our third point. So again, audience, if you have any questions, I see some already coming in. We will get to as many of these as possible when we wrap this up. So keep them coming. Our third point we wanted to talk about was the gray market that's being supported in many ways by these decriminalized areas. So Chris, as an entrepreneur in this space, what impact are you seeing from the gray market? What does it mean to you? And how are you seeing this unfold?
Well, it's unfolding really quickly is what I'm seeing. And I think there is some crossover happening from the cannabis industry, just because you see very similar and excellent branding and marketing that exists in the cannabis industry being applied to the gray and illegal psychedelic market. And it's becoming quite ubiquitous. You'll see it. We were discussing earlier about seeing brands at the Psychedelic Science Conference and being very out and open with what they had just in that public area, which is interesting. There's also, I believe that the decrim in Colorado is leading to a boom of people that have at least a feeling of a safety net to be able to start their companies and start their brands there. And that inevitably will spread via the internet, which it already is. It's amazing to me what you can find even here on LinkedIn, that people are openly displaying stuff for sale. Instagram's the same way. I get hit up on Instagram from brands all the time wanting me to follow them and openly selling psychedelics, which is also very interesting. And then spreading to the cannabis industry through the dispensaries, which it seems that it's pretty common knowledge that you can go ask for under-the-counter psychedelics in cannabis industries from New York to California.
That's great. I mean, it is changing rapidly, and I guess one of the questions that comes up a lot is how does the consumer know that what's in the ingredients? It's unregulated. So is it just a blind faith and trust in whatever brand you're buying that there's the psilocybin you want in it? I mean, what is safety? What's the role of safety in the gray market? I'll open that to whoever wants to answer.
I'll jump in there with that because I think this is an important reason for legalization and to support it, even if you don't necessarily support psychedelics, is because you don't know. If we could get some kind of groundwork laid where we have somebody overseeing it, you could potentially then know that, hey, that little chocolate bar is a microdose and not necessarily a hero dose. And I know people who have had that experience where they thought they were taking a subperceptual dose of psychedelics and ended up on an unexpected trip. And for some people who are doing it for medicinal purposes, that's not a good thing for them, particularly, a boomer that's trying to deal with maybe end of life care. And then all of a sudden they're in another world and it's not a great deal. So if we could, as this advances, hopefully you'll know. I mean, psychedelics, particularly mushrooms, there's a lot of variances in the potency from the stem to the cap, much less, when you throw a bunch of different things, grind it all up, it's not very consistent and you'll get a different experience that and some of them might not be expected.
Yeah, it's a good point. And obviously this has a lot of parallels with the cannabis industry and the gray market there, where legit licensed businesses are having to go compete against, cheaper priced, unregulated businesses. What advice could I mean, up and coming or aspiring psychedelic companies or cannabis companies looking to get in on this when they can, when and if they can, how are they supposed to react? Courtney, you advise a lot, and Bethany, you also work with firms. Whoever wants to jump in on that.
So I'll just make a point on, unfortunately, there is no legal mechanism to sell a psilocybin product except for if you're at a licensed healing center in Oregon, and that's still only state legal in the United States. All of these cities that have passed deprioritization policies, none of them permit commercial activity. And the same ethos is in Colorado with its decriminalization measure, which does allow sharing, but doesn't allow the sale of psilocybin or any other natural psychedelic medicine as part of like a business activity. And so I think it's important for people to just understand that right now, that the opportunities will come. Colorado will come online. Oregon is an option for licensure, but most of literally everything that we're seeing on the market today is not legally produced, and there isn't that additional necessarily third-party testing. We are seeing in Colorado and other states that have legalized drug testing equipment, which is the most important harm reduction tool that exists out there. But drug testing equipment is not widely used nor widely available. So it is very much know your product, know your manufacturer, and a lot of responsibility placed on the consumer to protect themselves.
Yeah. The last thing I would just highlight there from a business perspective, we work with a lot of cannabis clients that are looking for areas of growth, right? Cannabis has been a challenging market, and they've been looking at, psychedelics as, is this an area where I can potentially grow my business? Is this going to run into the same challenges? And I think what we're seeing right now, the foundations of what's starting to come out in the psychedelic space with the rise of the gray market, that any cannabis industry, any cannabis company that is looking at, expanding into psychedelics in the future should expect some of the same landscape that they're facing right now, in cannabis, where you still are going to have to battle a growing illicit market that is not necessarily playing by the same rules, where you have to kind of battle some brands that are starting to develop and be distributed. Consumers don't understand the difference between what's legally produced and what is produced on the illicit market. So just the rise of that gray market that that Chris was referring to, that we're seeing today. I mean, in the data we're seeing, 15% of Americans, or 15 million Americans, are already using these products when it's illicit. That's going to be a pretty considerable illicit market to battle. So just keeping in mind, this is going to start small. It's going to be a very limited business opportunities in the immediate term, and there will certainly be a battle against the illicit market that anybody that's looking to enter this space should be geared up to compete against.
All right, great points. Well, that's the illegal stuff. Then let's talk about what's legal and where are the opportunities. So we'll segue into our fourth point that we wanted to cover, which is really this wellness model that has surrounded the psychedelics movement. Being a health-focused, policies and everything that's being passed in state levels and at FDA is geared around wellness. So clinics and retreats are going to be one of the biggest, earliest businesses that are happening in Oregon, as we talked about, and soon in Colorado. Bethany, let's just start with you on your consumer research. I mean, how does the wellness model itself as a business model compare and contrast with the cannabis industry, and where are the overlaps in that space?
Absolutely. So in the cannabis industry, you have, people like to think about this as kind of the recreational market and the medical market. And really in cannabis, we're seeing a lot of overlap where people think about this as part of kind of their wellness routines, or kind of their wellness, part of their wellness. Cannabis is being used, the recreational market is certainly, the adult use market has grown at a much faster rate than the medical market there. But such a large percentage of consumers, of cannabis consumers, are using for anxiety, using for depression, using for just sleep and relaxation. We see about 70% of consumers using for kind of that sleep and relaxation. They are also using, one of the biggest differences, I think, between the way that consumers are thinking about cannabis and the way that they're thinking about psychedelics is really the way that it fits into their lifestyle. So more than 70% of American cannabis consumers are using at least once a day. So they are everyday users. This is integral to their to their lives. Almost 2/3 of users are using multiple times a day. So that's a lot of product being consumed on the cannabis side, and it's really kind of part of their day-to-day routine. With psychedelics, when we look at kind of this different model, that Courtney was highlighting earlier, if it's more about that, that supervised, use, or kind of these retreats. This is psychedelics, for these medicinal purposes are more thought of as things that will help you kind of let go of, some of your issues, or, be able to, address and kind of work through some past challenges. If it, as it refers to, PTSD, works through some challenges with, with depression, but they aren't necessarily thought of as products that you're going to use multiple times a day, every day, kind of for the rest of your life. So it really kind of changes, the way that consumers are looking at this and how it fits into their lifestyle, as well as really the business models for brands. Because if your consumer is coming in, and purchasing products to use, 3 times a day, every day, versus, somebody that's using once a month, or even once a week, it's a very different kind of business model and customer acquisition cost.
For sure. It's a wellness model is not a product sales model, for sure.
Yeah, it's not CPG, right?
Yeah, right. It's not CPG, but cannabis does have a role in the wellness side of things. Chris, you'd mentioned, some things you've heard about with ketamine and I don't know, can you share some of the ways cannabis does kind of play into the therapy and wellness model?
Yeah, and I don't have any experience with it personally, but from Psychedelic Science and hearing Aubrey Marcus talk about his preferred combination was actually ketamine and cannabis for his own personal therapeutic use. And those are 2 avenues that I think maybe could explore together to see if there's an opportunity there. Pre-legalization of other psychedelics for the cannabis industry, I think there's probably something to that to be explored.
Yeah, and that's great. And Courtney, also as a consultant, you've worked with firms. Is there a role for cannabis? I don't know, dispensaries or other places to expand into this kind of area? Is it I've read about studies being done on cannabis assisted therapy, as well as the cannabis ketamine stack that Chris just mentioned. But should dispensaries who want to get into the service business, is it a good idea to be looking at that, or is it just really 2 different creatures?
Dispensaries selling cannabis now, there's a lot of similarity in the regulatory structure of what those will look like. So as far as compliance goes, you're still going to have a state license. You're going to be under a track and trace model. You'll have to comply with all of those security requirements, et cetera. So for people that have cannabis experience in the regulatory system, a lot of those skills will be transferable. But as all of you touched on, the business model is quite different. So at least at the outset, these sessions with a facilitator using psilocybin are going to be about 4 to 6 hours. That means your facilitator, let's say it's one-on-one, is really going to only have the opportunity to maybe sit with 2 patients a day. So when you think about that, it's not like a dispensary where you go and you buy your product, you come and you could see 500 plus people in a business day. Here, it's a lot more patient oriented. It's a lot more expensive than purchasing an eighth of flower, for example. But that creates concerns both in accessibility and affordability as well. So there is crossover because cannabis is still federally illegal and state legal in most places, and that will be the same case with psilocybin. You could pair those business models theoretically, likely not on the same licensed premises. And I would not advise using cannabis with another psychedelic compound, especially ketamine. I know people do it, but that's just my word of advice. But for example, ketamine providers are regulated pursuant to DEA permitting. So they would actually be risking their DEA permitting to engage in the sale of a federally illegal Schedule I controlled substance, which is psilocybin and cannabis. So on that end, you would need totally separate business models by requirement, not just by risk mitigation. And there's a lot more complexity there in blending federally legal and federally illegal activities. But it's all possible. I just think the big thing is that these are very different consumer bases, usage indications, at least within the regulated state access model for psilocybin, and profit models too.
Okay, great, thanks. All good points. And that kind of brings us to our last point, which is the other legal area that the cannabis industry can kind of get in. This is more psychedelics adjacent. We're talking about functional mushrooms, which are legal products but are not psychedelics. And it's a very rapidly changing and growing industry. Chris, this is your specialty. Your company, First Person, puts out a functional mushroom set of products. So what are we talking about with functionals? What's the top level about these products, and how could they be integrated in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I think there's actually a huge potential in the cannabis industry. I think, a lot of times within our own industries, we get to thinking about things very narrow. But one of, like you said, functional mushrooms are already legal, always been legal, and they are not psychedelic. Some of them can be psychoactive. For instance, lion's mane mushroom, which is very good for the brain. At First Person, we're a brain health and performance company, so we're very into lion's mane mushroom, and I think there's a lot of synergy there. They're just really exploring the combination of in research of what functional mushrooms and cannabis can do. But I think if you think about even psychedelic mushrooms, there's a lot of anecdotal, experiential evidence out there that the combination definitely does something different. But I would look at it, if I was a cannabis company, from an intent product, like what's your intent of the product, and in the functional mushroom, there are different mushrooms that do different things, and I think you could complement your existing product line by pairing those with the intent of the cannabis product too. And I'd say concentrate on the big three mushrooms, on functional mushrooms, which are lion's mane mushrooms, cordyceps mushrooms, and reishi mushrooms. Lion's mane can be it's an anti-inflammatory in the brain, and it's neuroprotective. And no matter where you fall on, obviously this is going to be a pro-cannabis crowd, but there is research that says long-term consistent use can be damaging to the brain. So why wouldn't you want to counteract that with another natural product? And I would look at it, if I was a cannabis company, not only for adding them together, but potentially offering a whole other product line for the next day to say, here you go, let's rebuild those brain cells with some mushrooms. Maybe you've had too much the night before, and let's try to repair that damage or mitigate that damage at the very least. And mushrooms can definitely do that. Reishi is known to help sleep and relaxation. That can be paired with CBD or any number of other cannabis products. And cordyceps, very good for the cardiovascular system, for improving VO2 max, for improving endurance and athletic performance. And a lot of athletes already turn to cannabis use, sometimes even during their sport. So that would be a natural combination to go after and add them together.
That's great. Thanks for that. Courtney, were you going to jump in?
Oh,
Oh, no, sorry, Bethany, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I would just highlight on that as well. I mean, in cannabis, to Chris's point, this is they're incredible functional ingredients that can be added to so many different products. And in cannabis right now, we work with a lot of the innovation groups at some of the largest, cannabis companies. It's all about product differentiation, right? These markets are becoming so saturated with so many different brands that are all pretty comparable. So how do you get your brand to stand out? How do you kind of differentiate from what's happening on the shelves of dispensaries? CBD market, over the past year, the hemp derived CBD market has used these adaptogenic mushrooms, functional mushrooms incorporated in with CBD, through kind of the non-dispensary channel, through the hemp channel, to a great degree of success. They're very attractive to kind of those same consumers that are trying out new products, kind of these trendy enthusiasts, the people who are at the edge of all new trends. So it's really helped a lot of CBD brands, draw in new clients, try in new customers and kind of retain them with newer and exciting products. In cannabis, everybody's experimenting with like different cannabinoids right now, and CBG and THCV and THCA and all of the different cannabinoids. But there's only just some real dabbling that started to happen with functional mushrooms. So it's a real opportunity, for brands to consider in the cannabis space, and as a place, if you're thinking about mushrooms or you're thinking about these, categories where you can play now legally.
Thanks, Bethany. And, I guess, Chris, or Courtney, because I know you work with functional mushroom companies, from a consumer perspective and also from a dispensary wondering what product they might want to carry, there's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of claims around the health benefits of these. And I believe there's not a lot of, as much research being done as there are on psychedelic mushrooms. How do companies that want to carry this, dispensaries or consumers, go about navigating that to figure out what the benefits are and what do they look for on the label?
Well, I'll jump in there. There's the mushroom industry in North America is still at its infancy, but it's also growing really, really quickly. And so sourcing is important and can be an issue as you're developing products. There's not a lot of options out there, particularly if you're looking to scale something, and you want to be real careful about your source. Mushrooms have some issues that you should know. With solubility is an issue. If you're making gummies, taste is always an issue. And then, my advice would be concentrate on finding, if you're looking really for something that's going to have a health benefit, look for a fruiting body extract. And that will get you a long way down the line. If they're going through the trouble of making a fruiting body extract, which is more bioavailable to us, most of the medicinal compounds in mushrooms are locked in the cell walls of the mushrooms, and most people do not have the enzyme to break down that cell wall. So if you're buying a ground up mushroom or a ground up mycelium, as some people are selling and calling mushrooms, you're really not getting the benefit of it. And so you really want to make sure what you're getting, what you're sourcing, and make sure that it is a good product to go in it. We're working on some developments on solubility. If anybody has any questions of anything like sourcing or wants to be pointed in the right direction, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to help them.
Great.
And I can just touch on, just from like a general educational standpoint, the functional mushroom supplements and foods and beverages are subject to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, just like your hemp seed products or your traditional dietary supplements and foods. So they're subject to the same restrictions on making drug claims on a food or beverage item, and also on substantiation. But it is really important, because of how new this industry is, how little testing and education is out there, that you do your own research when it comes to not just taking the face value of a marketed ad or something like that on Instagram, and making sure you're looking at you're doing your own research yourself, as well as ensuring third-party testing, as we touched on in the beginning.
Good advice. Okay, this is great. We're at a good time to sort of break. We've covered our 5 topics. Thank you guys for getting into all that. We have a lot of great questions here, so we're just going to go right into them. This one's for Courtney. Courtney, do you believe FDA approval of MDMA will do anything for federal legalization of psychedelics overall? How much can that really move the needle?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that it will definitely reopen the floodgates for investment in psychedelic research. MDMA is grouped in the psychedelic bucket when it comes to just having conversations about the space and the industry and investment and all of that. And once MDMA is FDA approved, that at least procedure and process, that approved kind of package of MDMA, it's not just going to be like MDMA generically, will be rescheduled to a lower schedule, likely Schedule 2, because it does have some dependence liability if not used pursuant to instruction. But all of those safety studies that were used for that FDA approval will now be able to be used for other indications. So it really will kind of start the domino effect of these compounds do have medicinal benefit. Again, they're synthetic. Same with ketamine is synthetic. The psilocybin that we're seeing go through these drug trials is synthetic. So it's not likely to change the scheduling for the compound of itself, at least for not a long time. But it will, I do believe, kind of definitely move the needle when it comes to access, because we will have full federal sort of acknowledgement of medicinal value of these first Schedule 1 compounds. And they were all sort of, classified very quickly in the 70s and 80s without too much thought or research going into it. So I think it will be very important to show that now we are establishing this research, that maybe our original understanding of how these drugs were classified and just sort of blind adherence to these policies may need to be updated, put nicely.
Oh, that's great. And on the flip side, that's the FDA's role and maybe opening doors or not. On the state regulation side, with Colorado and Oregon, is it like cannabis? Did those 2 states come first, and now it's going to be easier for other states? Do you anticipate a smoother pathway to those sorts of regulated programs? And then do they pick up the Oregon model? Do they go after the Colorado model? How do you see what's happening now playing out in the next couple of years?
Sure. So Colorado was the first state in the country to adult use access to cannabis. So in that regard, Oregon was also early. That is true. I think a lot of the United States is going to watch Oregon and watch Colorado and sort of see what happens. I don't see too many more states jumping on a regulated access model in the next year or 2. Massachusetts is considering, I think, a ballot measure put on by some of the same people that have experience. But I do believe that cannabis paved the way for psychedelics to make progress so efficiently at the state and local level, because now we understand what a access model and compliance and funding and enforcement looks like for a Schedule 1 controlled substance that needs to be kept within the confines of a state boundary. And so, while there's completely different usage considerations, safety profiles, manufacturing considerations, et cetera, I do believe that cannabis's grassroots movement will make access to psychedelics at the state and local level much more efficient than it would have been trying to make psilocybin be that first mover.
Okay, great. Whoever wants to answer this one, why is psilocybin being tested as a synthetic and not as the natural mushroom?
I can touch on it since I brought it up, I suppose. Because it's easier to replicate the compound. So when you're doing drug manufacturing and drug research, you have to prove that you and everyone that you're testing this on is getting the exact same thing. So that's why it's so hard. That's why cannabis, struggles to get that FDA approval, because it's really, really hard to prove that same genetic consistency generation after generation, because we're dealing with nature, which is not supposed to be the same generation after generation. And so we do have a few people that have just gotten their DEA license for natural psilocybin research, Dr. Sue Sisley being one of them. But from drug development standpoint, it's much cheaper and easier to use synthetically produced psilocybin or any other compound for that matter because of its replicability. Not impossible though, but much easier.
Got it. Thank you. Chris, this may be for you as it's about the gray market. Why do folks even use the term gray market? Isn't it really just legal or illegal? Gray market seems to cause confusion. Isn't it just a euphemism for black market?
In most cases, yes, but let's take Colorado, for example, and then let's roll back in that wellness market. And so Colorado, you can grow and you can share. But you can have, a therapy center that is charging potentially for the therapy and sharing the medicine. And I think that's decidedly in the gray market right there, where would that hold up legally or not? Who knows, right? Until it's tested, who knows? But you're right. I would say if you're in California and you're selling psychedelics, that's definitely not gray market. That's definitely black market.
Okay, thanks. This is for go ahead, Courtney.
I think he made the point exactly, which is, at least in Colorado, the production and possession of it could be legal. That can be legal now, but the sale is not. And so giving some acknowledgement to a gray area. It exists, but it's very new and probably not what you're thinking of.
Yeah, and you wouldn't use the term gray market for a place like Minneapolis or a decriminalized city for
No,
yeah.
Unfortunately, no, because controlled substances are regulated at the state and federal level. So you can't decriminalize something that wasn't criminalized at the local level, which is just how it is. So I would say it's the lowest law enforcement priority. I think that's the most important way to remember it.
Okay, let's tackle a couple of social kind of questions. First, we have one. We need more training in psychedelic harm reduction. How do you see this happening? Anybody can jump in on this. Anyone have an opinion on harm reduction services? And
I think it's so important. I'm happy to do it. This is my favorite thing to talk about. We absolutely do. When it comes to, because we have this proliferation of news articles and research and excitement on all of the benefits of all of these wonderful medicines, spanning from psilocybin and other natural compounds to ketamine and MDMA, which have clear addictive potential. And we really aren't highlighting the shadow sides of these compounds like we should from a harm reduction and safety standpoint. While they do have wonderful therapeutic and spiritual and medicinal potential, they don't work the same for everyone. Your experience is very different than the person next to you. And it is really important to ensure that we are giving the full picture when it comes to the benefits and risks of psychedelic use, because there are some serious risks out there. Colorado and Oregon have adopted education programs. At least in Colorado's, there is funding, or will be funding, for an education program to help provide consumers with education on the law and the safety profile and things like that. But you're absolutely correct in that there's a huge need for it, and not enough people engaging in that right now. So happy to provide some resources, but definitely a real thing to think about. And just to reiterate the importance of doing your research before you engage in using any of these compounds.
okay, thanks. The other kind of semi-related question is, at least on the social front, is, do you think there will be social equity licensing programs in this industry?
Not in the exact same sense as cannabis, but there are provisions in policy to ensure more accessibility to underprivileged or communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs and things like that. It's harder to say. There's less of like a population group, and actually Bethany may be able to talk about this, but of like psychedelics arrests, that is less common than cannabis. It's more sporadic. And so there is a big push, or sincere push, for accessibility to licensure and helping even like especially indigenous groups who have been stewarding this medicine for thousands of years to have access to the industry. But it's not like when you think about cannabis social equity programs, we don't see that yet, at least for psychedelics.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head there, Courtney. I mean, when we look at who the consumers are and, the people that have been impacted, in when it comes to cannabis, those consumers have, of the legacy cannabis market, historically included a great deal of, Black and Brown communities that were disproportionately, put in jail for, possession or, or distribution. When you look at psychedelics, it's not necessarily the same consumer profile. We were sharing some of the numbers earlier that this is skewing more upper income. It's skewing more, skewing more Caucasian in terms of users. And so you don't see the same, and the distribution of, selling these things was less something that landed, a very large number of people in jail over the last 20, 30 years. So you don't see that same pushback when it comes to, communities of color. And, those social equity licenses have had some challenges in the cannabis space in terms of execution and being able to, actually create real opportunities for, minority, the minority consumers that or minority business owners that they were intending to help. So I don't think there's like models out there for social equity licenses that have been so successful that, when the psychedelics industry is looking for, blueprints from cannabis that they want to run to adopt, that's not necessarily going to be kind of first on the list. But, the primary exception there is Indigenous communities who, it's very well known and accepted that, this has been a part of their lives and a part of their cultures, for a long, for hundreds of years. And, you may see much more in terms of licenses, or business opportunities for those indigenous communities, as I think everyone in the industry would support.
Okay, thanks, Bethany. Let's try to get to a couple more here before we run out of time. I think this is for Courtney. Are U.S. states tracking or learning lessons from what's happening with legalized psilocybin and other psychedelics in Vancouver?
So people are definitely watching what's happening from a policy standpoint. Canada has been ahead of us both in cannabis accessibility, although it looks like we just got some amazing news on cannabis in the United States at the federal level. But they, Vancouver's been very focused on the harm reduction component. However, I haven't seen any model policy taken from Vancouver or anything like that, but we do look to Canada in a variety of ways when it comes to policy and the way that drugs are regulated in Canada versus the United States.
Okay, great. Let's do one last one here. This is a good one to end on, I think. This sounds like this is from somebody who works at a dispensary, and maybe just a final wrap-up question, because I think we've covered this in many ways, but are they ever going to allow cannabis companies to sell mushrooms? If so, we're all going to need more training and maybe a raise.
I don't know, you guys, I might be incorrect, but I just saw a news thing pop up saying HHS recommended that cannabis be moved to Schedule 3. So things might be really changing for cannabis in the next year or so here. I can see the potential because Oregon and the Department of Revenue, for example, in Colorado, the same regulatory agency is regulating both cannabis and psychedelics, but I don't see psychedelics being, or psilocybin, as you asked, being offered for take-home purchase in the near future. I think we'll start hopefully with microdosing if we could try to get people a little bit more comfortable with low dose. But you have some time, so don't worry yet.
Yeah, I believe it's inevitable, and some of that, like Courtney said, it may not happen right away as much as some people would like it to happen right away. But and as Bethany was pointing out, as that younger generation starts to be in positions of decision making, you'll see this change really quickly at that point.
Yeah.
Great. Bethany, do you want to weigh in on whether they're going to be selling any?
I would just say that it would actually be great if it could, when it comes to education, because the dispensary model has, cannabis companies have really been able to nail bud tender education as kind of a way to communicate to the consumer what their products are, what they do, how they can use them, and the bud tender is such a key part of that, distribution process. More than half of, people walking into a dispensary ask bud tenders about how, what products they should purchase, and how this is going to impact them. And there's, certainly models put in place to, for brands and companies to provide that education to, to dispensaries. So it would be a very efficient, far more efficient than a black market or kind of a, gifting type of model to be able to kind of get that education into the hands of the consumers. But there would certainly need to be a lot of bud tender education, I think, in place before anybody would be able to confidently, talk to patients or consumers about it. So hopefully in the future, but it's a ways away, I think, today.
Thanks, Bethany. Okay, we're out of time. I wanted to say thank you to our panelists, but also to our audience for asking such great questions. Our 2-day conference this year is going to cover all of these topics in much greater depth. It's a B2B conference. We are there to empower and educate and help people set up aspiring psychedelic businesses or layering in some level of the things we've talked about today. So again, if you opted in when you signed up for this webinar, you'll be getting a promo code for discounted tickets. So please register soon. And again, thank you to Courtney, Chris, and Bethany. Appreciate you guys being here. And we'll do this again sometime.